All right, wonderful. Well, first up, again, a very, very, very warm welcome to all of you who've taken the time to sort of join us today. I'm so incredibly excited to have the opportunity to welcome an incredibly sort of distinguished panel to have an interesting conversation about the state of social impact and impact measurement itself in India. Before I kick us off, I just wanted to share a bit of an introduction to why we're actually having this conversation today. For as many of you know, just last week, 60 Decibels launched a very exciting impact measurement report in India. Before I dive into that, just a quick intro to 60 Decibels itself. We are, a tech-enabled global listening-centric impact measurement company. Our philosophy and mission is to really help listen to those all of us seek to serve and make sure that their voices are really informing, participating, and really a core element of how impact organizations, businesses, investments around the world are made. And today we're going to be focusing on our work in India, which is one part of our sort of global approach where we work in about 90 plus countries around the world. So that's really a bit of background about 60 Decibels. And today is really just an exciting and a nice sort of excuse to have a meaningful conversation about social impact in India. Last week we launched this report where we sort of consolidated the data we had collected and the interviews and the conversations with 24,012 respondents from 28 states who had been served by 115 socially minded organizations. They were social businesses, they were nonprofits, they were foundations, they were sort of international organization-supported programs that were aimed towards serving these communities. I really want just the first 2 minutes to say three interesting things about this report, and then we're going to, kind of really move on from it and hear from these incredible voices on the panel. The first is that what's very exciting in this report is you'll notice that there is a spread of outcomes and performance data across these 115 organizations. That's possible because we've asked the same sets of questions to all these respondents, and many of these respondents are actually able to compare and contrast impact performance. The second is all of the data has been segregated and disaggregated by both gender and sector. This is something that's the norm for our work at 60 Decibels, but it's just very exciting to see the differences in outcomes and experiences and profile between male and female respondents. And that's just something that's, a basic bar for us at 60 DB. And last but not least, we've had the joy of highlighting certain top performers, such as Make a Difference, Dost Education, Mobile Academy, and also highlight case studies of how impact-oriented organizations, one of which FarMart on this panel, and one of our other longest-standing clients, Umidyar Network India, how they use this data for decision-making is something that we've captured and something we're going to dive into a little bit more in detail in today's panel discussion. One last housekeeping thing before I dive right in and introduce our exciting panelists is please don't hesitate to drop in any and all questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If possible, it would be great if you could assign your question to either Alekh, Divya, or Tinni. That way, I can point the question to them directly once we wrap up their comments and the discussion. And really, that's about it. Sit back, relax. As I mentioned in my note, if you have a cup of chai or water or coffee, please settle into that because I think we're going to have a really, really fun and engaging conversation today. So first up, I'd like to introduce Alekh. Alekh is the co-founder and CEO of FarMart, a B2B agri-tech business. And they do a lot of really, really exciting work with, retailers and farmers across the country. And I just want to say two things about both the financial sort of scale as well as the impact of FarMart. One, as FarMart, as Alekh mentioned to me just yesterday, they're sort of seeing almost $250 million in sort of revenue around their work globally. They're expanding to countries beyond India. But, as with this conversation, there's an element of sort of financial sustainability and an element of deep social impact. And just one stat I wanted to mention is that in one of the surveys we did with FarMart, who we've worked with now for the last 3+ years, 90% of their retailers reported quality of life improvements as a result of access to the platform that FarMart offers. That's just one of the many impact outcomes they're generating. And so with that, Alekh, first up, I'm going to sort of hand it over to you to sort of tell us a little bit about FarMart, as well as why you exist and what your approach to impact is.
Sure. Thanks, Pranav, for having me, and thank you everyone for attending this. So, just a quick intro about the company. We basically are a SaaS-enabled B2B food commerce company, where we help food businesses across the globe now to help source both raw and processed material through a network of first mile farmers and retailers. And the innovation we kind of brought to the market was that, and almost like our thesis of change or thesis of impact was that traditionally agriculture is supposed to be run by like a asset heavy supply chain where we would deploy physical assets on ground, whether it's micro warehousing or it's basically physical logistics, or basically delivery centers. And then you would basically go region by region, and kind of scale your business up. So the intuitive change we made to the market was we believe that there are many people who are very close to farmers, who basically like L-1 who have deep networks with the farmer, who are the trust networks of the farmer. Why can't we build software and products for these mom and pop stores to basically help service farmers better, whether it's about inputs, advisory, hyper local trust, or other services. And on top of that, you basically leverage their existing infrastructure, whether it's their micro storage abilities, whether it's their relationship with their farmers or their first mile logistics network, to basically build almost like a cloud warehousing kind of a model at the first mile. And the whole thesis around the way we think about the business and the scale up is that rather than trying to squeeze every profit out of the value chain, we basically are enablers. We enable everyone who's important in the value chain to basically generate more income from themselves, and indirectly we have a massive impact on the whole value chain. So the way we think about the world is that as we move from era where a lot of investment is required in terms of building infrastructure, why doesn't that investment move into building capacity of existing people in the value chain? And how does technology play a extremely critical role in terms of either removing information asymmetry, but yet also enabling financial services, as well as any kind of support they require for their local communities. So it's a very community-led model, and we always encourage in design thinking in whatever products we build, where at the core, the users in the value chain, whether it's the farmer, first mile mom and pops, processors, are able to basically generate more income for themselves and indirectly create more impact in the local communities.
Fantastic, Alekh. Thanks so much for that introduction. And before I move on to Tinni, just one quick 60-second question for you is, and this is something you felt very passionately about, is, do you feel, or how do you feel about the conversation around trade-offs between creating social impact in a meaningful way and running a financially sustainable business? Do you think those go hand in hand? Do you think there are trade-offs and choices you need to make that are difficult? Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Alekh, yeah. I don't know if you got that question, but I can just quickly repeat it, which is I'd love to understand if you feel like there's a trade-off you experience between financial performance and creating social impact.
Yeah. So I actually don't, and I mean it's weird to say this, but I feel like there is actually no trade-off in today's world. I think we are going through an interesting time in life where it's almost at the intersection of business and impact and sustainability. So fundamentally, in the organization of the future, and the people who want to work with these organizations will realize very quickly that if they want to attract the best talent, or they want to attract capital, whether it's public markets, private markets, many of these things happen at the intersection of things, right? So it's extremely important to be cognizant of the footprint you have on the ecosystem, and how you think about designing your business accordingly. Because like in 20 years from now, or even 5 years from now, I don't feel there will be organization which will so-called not have an impact on the world. We already are going through a rough patch, and whether it's about the earth or whether it's about people. So I think it's kind of extremely important now, especially now that these two things go hand in hand, and organizations realize very early on in their journey that you have to there is no basically you can't take a side on these two aspects. Almost like having one foot on one paddle versus the other. So I think it's extremely important to go hand in hand.
Super, super. Thanks so much, Alekh. Really appreciate that perspective. Next up, I'm gonna sort of introduce Tinni. Firstly, Tinni, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today as well. Just as an introduction, Tinni has over 35 years of experience across multiple social impact areas such as sustainable livelihoods, sort of regenerative, climate resilient agriculture and livestock development. And I will say that our work with the and she is of course the chief executive of the Aga Khan Foundation in India. And I know I'm speaking for our team in India, where we've, one of the longest standing projects we've done is with the Aga Khan Foundation, specifically called Project Mesha in Bihar, which focuses on sort of supporting and working closely with Pashu Sakhis and goat rearers across the state and really supporting them in many meaningful ways, which I know Tinni will talk a little bit about. And as with all of this, I just want to emphasize quickly really that customer or that community perspective in this case. And just one stat from a recent study we did with the GVK program of AKDN was where we spoke with over 1,100 of the Pashu Sakhis. And just to give you a sense of that depth of impact, 99% of respondents said that they experienced that GVK program or something like that for the first time. So just going to show the type of like first time sort of deep impact that the work that Tinni and her team are doing. And so with that, Tinni, really the same question in some ways to you, which is what is your philosophy of social impact and how do you go about approaching that? Over to you, Tinni.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pranav, and wonderful to be here. Also wonderful to be with my co-panelists, Alekh and Divya as well. A very good afternoon to all those who've joined. This is a very interesting topic, and we look forward to quite a few questions and a good dialogue as well. So just briefly, in the Aga Khan Foundation, we're a global development foundation. We work in around 15 countries. In India, we've been working since 1978. Given that India is a really large country and regions are really different, AKF in India works in a few geographies, but in those geographies we have a long-term commitment to that region and to the communities in that region. So we work with a long-term perspective. We work across sectors, so we have a large footprint in agriculture. In fact, the program that Pranav spoke about, Project Mesha, is part of our women's economic empowerment program in the agriculture sector that we work in. We also have a very robust climate resilience portfolio. We do a lot of work on regenerative agriculture, working with community groups to support farmers to transition away from chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides. We also have a very strong footprint in early childhood development. We work with children and caregivers and frontline workers in the supporting children in the 0 to 6 years age group, supporting them also for school readiness and then transitioning into education. We also work on education. All of our work on early childhood development and education is we collaborate extensively with the government. We work with government schools. We work with government Anganwadi centers. We also have a flagship program on the empowerment of adolescent girls that is under implementation in the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And in fact, just last week, we had one of the girls from our program in Uttar Pradesh winning the Amal Clooney Global Award for Women's Empowerment, which was which was really great for us. She's an e-rickshaw driver in the state of Uttar Pradesh, and some of you would have seen the press. I mean, was extensively covered in the local press as well. We also have a large footprint on wash and sanitation. We are collaborating with the government on the Jal Jeevan mission as well, which is again a flagship program of the government of India. So that's a little bit about the Aga Khan Foundation. In terms of the significance of assessing the impact of the work that we do, that is inbuilt across our work. Given that we have a long-term commitment to geographies and communities, we really want to assess whether the work that we are doing is making a transformation in the lives of communities. So therefore, impact assessment is very, very important for us. We assess both the outputs of the work that we do, which is short-term results. We also look at the outcome, but in the longer term, we also look at the impact, particularly on the quality of life of the communities. Have communities got better as a result of the interventions that we are doing? That is something that we very closely track. We have developed a set of impact indicators that cover outputs, outcomes, and impact. we are increasingly trying to move forward in our work on impact assessment from reach and benefit to really looking at how we are empowering and transforming communities. So therefore, for example, we also do a lot of work in building community institutions, investing in their capacity so that in the future they can lead and take forward the work that has been started. So sustainability is inbuilt also in the work that we do. I'll stop here, and if there are any questions, we can come to that later. Thanks.
Fantastic, Tinni. I know you touched a little bit about the sort of on the next question around impact measurement, but just one again, very quick 60-second question for you is, likewise to Alekh, in Alekh's case, obviously there's a question or this attempt, thought of a trade-off between financial performance and impact performance. In your case, when you talked about focusing on the long term and not the short term, or focusing on sort of really sustainability creating, this kind of impact, what kind of would you say as a foundation that's so deeply embedded in these communities are some of the trade-offs that you experience when going through your programs? Are there any particular ones that you have to grapple with to sort of take those difficult decisions in creating long-term sustainable impact in these communities?
So, for example, say if I were to just give the example, say from Project Mesha in Bihar, the first, that is a women's economic empowerment program, but you cannot empower women economically without looking at also the, the societal norms that actually govern issues of whether women, have the mobility, whether they can step out of their homes. And Project Mesha has actually worked with communities together to try and change these norms. So, for example, the gender division of labor, how do you build an understanding around the gendered division of labor, the fact that perhaps women are really overburdened and a program that you bring in might even be burdening them further, but they have to make the choices that here is where they are getting their income from, this income is going to empower them, they'll be able to take their decisions. So I think that is something, balancing the short term with the long-term result, and taking communities alongside that journey. Because see, everyone is interested. For example, the work on drinking water, right? The first thing is that people want access to drinking water, but there is a long-term effort also in terms of the operation and maintenance of the infrastructure that is created, that requires investment in building communities, having the community come together to discuss how this asset will be managed in the future. So I think balancing the short-term gains that will happen immediately with the long-term investment in tracking the results of something, and also making mid-course corrections as you go along. So I think those would be some of the, never lose sight of the long-term, even if you're working on the short-term gain. I remember when I started my career in rural development, someone whom I have immense respect for, Deep Joshi, he told me, Tinni, always remember that what you do today, how is it going to pan out 10 years from now, 15 years from now? Yeah. Think of that when you take that step today in the community. So I think that is one thing that we should always keep in mind.
Fantastic. Tinni, thank you so much. And, Alekh, for a later question coming in the panel, I think thinking about maybe what are those like multiple problems that you're working with retailers and farmers to solve is something we'd love to hear about as well. With that, Divya, I'm going to move to you. It's a pleasure to have you on this call. Firstly, just a quick introduction to the Impact Investors Council in India. I think, it probably shouldn't be a name that anyone's sort of not heard in this group, but really it's a sort of membership and sort of convening body when it comes to impact investing in India. It's been, it's really sort of probably the go-to when it comes to impact investors, as well as bringing different sort of members, policymakers, and regulators into the segment. And Divya, particularly, I know that you head up research at IIC and have extensive experience, prior to IIC, even in commercial banking and working with impact startups. And so really would love to hear a bit of an overview of, the work of IIC at a high level, but also just understanding, given that you play this sort of bringing people and bringing different elements of the sector together role, why you think that's important and how you think it's helping move the sector towards creating greater social impact. So really over to you, Divya.
Sure. Thank you, Pranav. Thank you for having us here, and congratulations on the launch of the report. So to give a quick context to the work that IIC does, we are a member-based industry body. So IIC has close to 65 odd members. These include asset managers, equity asset managers, international LPs, philanthropic foundations, DFIs, other ecosystem players. And what IIC really does, like you said, is play like the convener or the kind of intersection between these different stakeholders coming together. So we have different interventions, one being research, wherein we create knowledge collateral, and the focus is on building the capacity, the knowledge capacity of the ecosystem as a whole around different aspects of impact investing, including impact measurement, of course. Apart from that, how can we as an industry body sitting in the middle of this entire space forge these conversations which are so important to happen between different groups of stakeholders? Because what we really see is a requirement for this alignment to happen. So this is something which IIC has been continually working on with our member engagement, with the partner engagement that we have. We curate a set of programs across different themes. So climate investing is a focus, blended finance is a focus. We look at agriculture, wash, education, all the impact sectors. And how can we create the capacity and the knowledge and the partnerships and the interactions between everybody to build impact investing in India? Coming to the second part of what you asked, so we have been speaking to LPs, we've been speaking to GPs, and what we've been observing through these conversations is that there's an inclination to participate in more impact investing in India. India is being looked as a very strong investment destination. However, there needs to be some sort of alignment between how impact is perceived, what does it mean when it comes to different sectors, how are the LPs, for example, the LPs are extremely keen to understand how are the GPs assessing impact, how are they defining impact, what kind of metrics are being seen, what kind of exits are expected. The GPs, on the other hand, because they work with on ground with the investees, there are challenges like Alekh and Tinni have spoken about, and how can they gather or define that kind of framework which is actually contextualized to what India is. So these are the different aspects at play when it comes to building like an impact measurement understanding. We recently hosted the India room in Singapore, which again saw all these players coming together. We were recently a part of the United Nations Harvest Forum, and this kind of understanding has been voiced at all these platforms, that there is a constant inclination to be able to understand and articulate what impact really means for everyone.
Fantastic, Divya. Thank you so much for that. And just the immediate question as you were speaking that came to my mind was, when you talked about these different stakeholders, whether they be sort of LPs, GPs, foundations, impact enterprises. Again, this is my theme for questions in this first segment, which is, what do you experience any sort of trade-offs or differences in terms of what people's expectations are? So one example that comes to my mind often is that LPs sometimes expect the impact data coming from the GPs. The GPs might expect that data coming from the underlying portfolio companies. The portfolio companies might expect. And so when it comes to impact measurement, do you experience some kind of tensions between the different stakeholders or challenges or questions? And I'm curious, what your views are there.
Sure. So yes, LPs do expect this nature of reporting to be made to them by the GPs. GPs do require this data to come in from their investee companies so that they can build the framework. However, I think what really is the area to be worked upon is to understand how can all these frameworks and how this data and expectations be aligned to the sectors and the geography you're working in. Because oftentimes the kind of impact frameworks which are currently existing in the market are not really India aligned. There is a lot of Western context to it, which is what probably the LPs are viewing the space from. The GPs are working to adapt to these metrics and build their own bespoke, numbers or metrics to it. This requires the investees to be able to give that kind of data. Data gathering across sectors, across depth and breadth, like Tinni said, the short term versus the long term, outcomes versus the output. All this is challenging because there is a lot of data at play. So to be able to have a standardized framework of sorts, which everybody can align to, keeping the sectoral nuances in mind and keeping India in mind, is what is really the ask of the overall system.
Super, so helpful, Divya. And I think I'll move to sort of Alekh for the next segment. But I think one question that I'd love for you to think about and maybe respond to later is, as examples of when that's actually been successfully done, where that alignment has been achieved to some extent, or what successes we can look for in that segment. But super helpful, Divya. Thank you for that. Alekh, I'm actually going to go to you, and I'm conscious of how much time we've spent on this fun section, but I think I'm going to ask maybe a couple of questions together so I can hear all of your responses and leave some time for Q&A at the end. So Alekh, the two-part question I have for you in this next segment is, A, what are some of the sort of opportunities and challenges that you've experienced with impact measurement at FarMart? That's one. And then related to that, if you can give an example of actually how you've used the data for decision making, because I think that's probably the one big challenge where people are often trying to figure out, okay, we've collected impact data, but what do we do with it? Like, how do we approach that process of collecting it? What are the challenges, opportunities there? But then what are examples of using that to both increase social impact, but also if you can tell me whether that's actually informed financial performance for FarMart as well. So really over to you, Alekh.
Yeah, so I think for FarMart, what we internally, really imbibe is that most of the companies, we try to understand obviously, okay, where is the business going? Let's say, for example, you just said like number of suppliers transacting on the platform, which lead to number of transactions happening on the platform with the buyers, which leads to obviously like a revenue number, right? I think in my experience, what we realize is oftentimes the input metrics get ignored a lot in the early phase, and as you kind of go in terms of growth of your company, right? What starts to happen is that you think everything is going well, but basically, has your company continues to invest in, let's say, network building, or has your company continue to invest in and is a company actually following the core mission of what you stood out for in the beginning, right? Oftentimes in this growth journey, that kind of gets lost somewhere in between, right? So the way we thought about this is firstly, I think measurement of your performance can not only be internally done, and when I say that is, you're always overwhelmed with numbers within the company. You have KPIs, you kind of figuring out how the company is trending. But in my view, until unless there is a third party independent review of what your network looks like, or is your network actually getting the value in terms of your value proposition to your customers, and then what is maybe a simple thing like NPS score of your customers, right? So I think there has to be an independent body which the company can empower to basically actually understand the length and breadth of the impact, and continuously monitor over a period of time, over a few evaluations, right? And then you can get to a safe place where you feel over a few quarters or over a few years, like the program has really helped and impacted a lot of people. I think what is critical, in this whole thing is that you have to have a very outside in view of your impact, and also be very true to whether it's working or not, right? If it's not working, you have to find newer ways and improve your product, or have better just design thinking around that. So I think outside in view is number one. I think second is collaborating your external data with your internal data, and how that is trending through that. And some work we did with you guys over the last 3 years, it's part of every senior level discussion we have, or any internal investor discussion we have. In fact, our internal reporting, which is on an annualized basis or a quarterly basis to our investors, which are internal investors, and I'm sure Divya has seen it across companies, like we actually have a sustainability and impact mandate to provide these numbers to our investors. So I think more and more this trend is going to get more real, and it's already there. I think it's not even now that the moment has come, it's already there. I think companies that beyond a certain scale, post PMF, will have to look at this more seriously.
Fantastic, Alekh. So if I could just sort of, that element of like outside in view, external plus internal data, and then that sort of already baked into the reporting that you do on a quarterly or an annual basis sounds really great. At the risk of, maybe asking a bit of a tough question, you described the fact that, sometimes, when you get that data, you've got to like take a hard look and say, okay, what's not working? How do we adapt it? So 2 quick questions related to that. One, could you share an example of a time when that might have happened? So when you actually were a bit surprised, or you were like, wow, I thought we were having deeper impact than we actually are based on this data, and how do we adapt the product offering to create that impact? I'm not sure if there's an example that comes to mind. And then second is just link. I mean, I think one of the things that sometimes happens with impact measurement, it becomes this big, messy, very complicated thing. Can you think of one indicator and you're like, wow, that one indicator, I got this data and it just maybe simplified things, because that's really the goal, right? It's to simplify our understanding of impact and make decisions based on it. So any responses there would be fantastic.
Yeah, so I think the one metric we really care about is increase of our share, like our partners, and I think when the response initially came in, it was around 57%, and that hit me hard. Like, and any entrepreneur who starts a business, right, like they have like obviously maybe financially they have to do well, but I think at the core they are like really mission oriented. And because it's a very, very long game, you get tired, and if you don't reorient yourself to the mission, almost like there's no point, like you don't have enough fire to go all the way, right? So I think like that one metric really hit me hard, that okay, only 57% of people really feel that their incomes have risen through the model, right? Or what we are doing right or wrong. So I think that metric really hit me hard. And in terms of, what is the second part of the question? I kind of missed that.
No, I think you answered it in the first one, Alekh, which was what is an indicator that you care about, which is income. And you were like, that's
Yeah,
what that's our
income
core
basically.
focus.
So for us, like honestly, I know a lot of people care about a lot of things, but I just realize, there has to be a direct income benefit to the stakeholder you work with. I think,
Got it.
if you're able to, make the life better, and better is subjective, right? In so many ways, and emotionally, you can't really measure that metric. But in our cases, like businesses, like which are, social mission driven, I think direct impact on income is kind of like the most important metric that
Super.
people should measure, because that really has like a outsized impact on their life, their family, the community. Because if you have a community-led model and your partners are making money, indirectly that you have created a lot of impact on the first mile around the community which they engage with.
Super. Thanks a ton for that, Alekh. And just before I sort of transition from that, the one thing I really took away the idea of, like, for a mission-oriented entrepreneur, having that understanding of what that core impact is so important, because as the journey gets hard, that's what you'll be your North Star in terms of driving you. So that's a very, very helpful lesson to take away, Alekh. Tinni, before I just come to you, one quick note for all of the sort of participants and audience members is we're about 30 minutes into the conversation, and I currently see 2 questions. I myself have like 6 on my notebook that I'm trying to hold back, so I'm sure you'll have many more questions. Please just take a few minutes to drop them in, because I think they'll really help the conversation in about 15 minutes time when we'll open to questions. So with that, Tinni, I'm going to come to you. And I think, obviously, as you already described in your introduction, you're so deeply data rooted in terms of how you understand impact, both for the long term and the short term, so that you're actually aware and you can say with confidence that you're creating the impact you intend to have, right? And so I think, again, with the perspective of what are some of the like challenges you've experienced when trying to do that, and how have you overcome them, how have you learned from them, is one part of it. And then second, again, if you could really sort of, you already gave a few examples of how you use the sort of data to sort of inform sort of gender, especially women empowerment, and the fact that, it informed how you supported them more broadly. So if you could speak more to the challenges of using or impact measurement and using it, but also examples of how you use the data, I think that will be really helpful.
So I wouldn't say, in terms of challenges, it is how you design evaluations. And just linked to the point that Alekh said was, I really agree that, third party to assess impact is really a very good step. I mean, you can use your internal, team members to perhaps assess the outputs, because those are more short term. But if one is really looking at transformation in the communities that you serve, in the communities that you work with, I think having a third party eye is a very good practice also, so that you get that unbiased information. Also, in terms of, and it's linked to a question that has also come in the chat, that the qualitative assessments, right? Those are very important. So we shouldn't just be looking at numbers. We should also be looking at what has been some qualitative assessment. So a combination of tools that assess the quantitative impact, even again, back to Alekh's point, like something like income, it might seem very straightforward, but actually there are other determinants also of that income, like, how has the asset base actually improved of households that you're working with. Often people shy away from really telling you how much they have actually earned as a result of it. But if you triangulate that with other data points, that helps you actually respond to that question. So I would say focusing on both quantitative measures and qualitative measures is an approach that we have really benefited from. Triangulating data is also very important. And sometimes, particularly for our work on agriculture, the impact on soil health really has to do with regular testing of soil. So we also invest in doing that. the space of assessing impact is also now becoming much more complicated, I'd say, with the whole discourse around emission data, GHG emissions, all of that. So there we also then reach out to technical partners to help us assess that the work that we are doing is much more environment friendly. Linked to the point on how impact, the question on how impact assessments have really helped us, again, back to what Alekh said. So we were also picking up, particularly from the lean data surveys that 60 Decibels has done for us year on year. We were picking up that the income of the women that we've supported, the Pashu Sakhis, the paravets on the ground, is increasing. But there was always this point that, they face challenges. So we deep dived into what were those challenges. And one of the challenges that did emerge was that because these women had to go door to door in very remote parts of their village, vaccinating livestock, all of that, there were times when they did not feel very safe doing that. And therefore, that was holding them back from really reaching their full potential. So we actually did an implementation intervention where we actually undertook self-defense training for all of these women. Whether they use that or whether they don't, the fact that they knew about it gave them that confidence that whatever happens, hum isko kar payenge. So I'm just saying that that's how we have actually used impact assessments to really help us in our implementation strategy. Another thing, see, we sometimes we also want to change the discourse around evaluation systems to also not make them extractive, but to go back to the community with the findings. Share it in community meetings that, the water in the wells has risen as a result of the water conservation that has happened. Now can we put in place some measures to efficiently use the water? So to take the findings back to the community must be a necessary step that we should do. So that evaluation becomes acceptable to everyone. So I'll just stop here. There are questions coming quickly in the chat.
Yes, which I'm very excited to see. And I think if it's all right, Tinni, I'm going to come back to you for some questions in the Q&A session, because I know there are a couple in the chat for you as well. But super, super helpful. And again, just in terms of takeaway, I think the element, there's multi-dimensional element to income, with the fact that, asset bases are growing. The fact that you need to go back to communities with that data, I think, is another very, very important aspect. Quant plus qual, and then triangulating impact. So Tinni, thanks a ton for that. And I have two questions for you, but I'm going to hold them just for now and come back to you. Divya, would love to sort of hear your thoughts on a few things, especially because you come from a more sort of wider sector lens, right? And understanding what different stakeholders are sort of thinking about. So one, and actually this is linked to the first question in the chat also, is this idea of giving, if you have any examples of sort of differences in impact metrics between, say, Western LPs and what is more relevant to an Indian context, or an example where that, trade-off emerged, that will be very interesting. But even more broadly than that, Divya, I think understanding what you think is the state of impact measurement in the Indian sector context right now, what the challenges are, and where are you seeing examples where you're seeing that the data is being used and actually informing decision-making in a meaningful way. That will be very helpful.
Sure. So, Pranav, answering, the first question, which is there in the chat. Now, more in terms of a difference in metrics, the way I would see it is the depth of the reporting, which needs to be aligned. For example, if there is an investment which is being made to further gender equity or agriculture or climate, the metric or the reporting would have to go beyond the number of lives impacted. While that's definitely an important metric to say that, because of the portfolio or the investee companies, how many eventual beneficiaries have benefited. Beyond that, how can we actually substantiate what it means to have quality healthcare? What does it mean to have quality education? So to give you an example and the context which Tinni also alluded to earlier, in the Indian socio-economic context of women equity will be quite very different from how you would see it in other geographies. So what quality really means, I think, to give an example, that's what I would quote to be able to define that, articulate that. And even, while we keep the geography in context, we'd also have to look at the sector. So what it would mean in healthcare, quality will mean different. What it would be in agriculture, like Alekh spoke, the farmer incomes or the increase in the farmer incomes, or over a period of time, what was the income earlier and what is the additionality that the portfolio, the investment has contributed to, that level of growth. So this requires in-depth data gathering, verification, and analysis. So I think it's more about being able to align and come to a practical approach of what can be really done, what could be reported, without making the entire framework extremely unwieldy, because that's also a risk which a lot of asset managers could run into if you try and make it an extremely lengthy metric reporting process. So I think to answer the question, it's more about getting the quant and the qual right for the given sector. To the next point that you mentioned, so what we are observing is a lot of keenness to learn from each other and to be able to constantly improve the impact measurement process, because everybody acknowledges one thing, that there is no one size fits all for all the sectors. While healthcare would require how many beneficiaries have gotten access to primary healthcare and what has this resulted in their overall reduction in medical expenses. Climate would require you looking at what has been the reduction in GHG emissions, as well as probably within agriculture, how has the soil health benefited, how has the agri yield benefited. These different aspects cannot be force fitted across sectors, and they would also be different for different investee companies. Not every portfolio company in agriculture is working in the same direction. So this is one thing which everybody acknowledges, to be able to take maybe an international framework and build certain India-specific nuances on top of it. Having said that, there is a strong inclination, and we are observing that too, to be able to align some of the broader metrics, broader framework, which everybody globally is talking about, be it measuring the impact to the UN SDGs, be it looking at what ESG is talking about and how can you take what E and S mean and kind of build that into your assessment. Or given while you're assessing agri and while you're assessing health and education, how can you build the gender lens metrics on top of it? So these are some of the trends. But one very interesting thing which we came across in some of our recent conversations is about investors willing to explore how can monetary values be attached to impact outcomes. And this is something which can give, can birth a lot of different ways of financing and investing. But this is a conversation which is now something we are seeing gain momentum. And for this, we see asset managers and LPs willing to invest in their internal capacities to be able to build these frameworks, be it internal training for their teams, tying up with independent verification agencies. So overall, there is a growing interest and a seriousness to develop a standardized practice for the Indian context.
Fantastic. Divya, again, as you were speaking, I think a couple of things that really stood out is this balance of these one size does not always fit all. The fact that we have to go significantly beyond number of people reach to outcomes, and then thinking about more innovative ways and ways to learn from one another, and invest in in some extent monetizing impact outcomes and thinking about what that could look like, right? I see we're now coming to the last 15 minutes of today's discussion, and so I'm just gonna shoot us straight ahead to the questions, because I've just been delighted by the range and types of questions coming in the chat. And I think the first one that I just want to assign, Tinni, get your thoughts on, which I was very curious about, is there's this question from that's focused on how one attributes impact, right? So is that how important is that to you? How do you approach it, given that so if you read the question, as you can see, it can we attribute the impact directly to our intervention if it operates at the system level but aims to produce results at the child level, right? So that's one key element, and so that would be great to hear from you on, Tinni.
So attribution is definitely there, because even the question mentions that children learn from multiple sources. So how do you then attribute their learning outcomes to the work that you've done? So we often use control and treatment to actually clear it from the attribution lens. So when we're tracking long term, we do have, say, a treatment arm and a control arm, and then you undertake evaluations directly, because that then takes care of the attribution issue, because both would have had the same access to external interventions as well. So how do you really track the outcome of the work that you're doing, say, in terms of learning outcomes? But yes, that is always a question mark. So for example, if you're training farmers on new agricultural approaches, farmers are also getting information from multiple sources. So how do you then attribute their adoption practices to what you have actually your intervention has trained them on? So attribution is always a concern, and therefore it is also some of the limitations of evaluation studies, and it's good to put it out there. It's also good to do secondary analysis of data as part of the evaluation reports, because secondary data also gives you very valuable insight. So we also do a lot of secondary data analysis. We work, for example, in some of the aspirational districts. So we also look at the aspirational districts dashboards that also give you indicators that this district is moving forward on these indicators. So, but yes, the concern is definitely there, and that was a wonderful question that was asked. I think there is another question that is, to me, and that is on how do you actually bring to communities the short-term, versus the long-term. In my work, and I've traveled extensively in villages across India, I am always struck by the wisdom of communities who understand, say, even our some of the work recently that we have done on tree planting. Trees take a long time to grow, right? But the kind of wisdom that communities bring to that space, they know that this is going to yield results in the long term. In the short term, we will make do by doing, this. There are also, if you discuss with communities, say around groundwater issues, if you bring out the issue that groundwater is a common resource, and if this is openly discussed with communities, they themselves come up with norms. So I would say there's a lot of wisdom that communities have. It is their villages that they have seen grow and develop. And if we invest the time in those community processes, so in our work, we lay a lot of emphasis on community processes, communities coming together to discuss how they would like to take this. And this short term versus long term is brought out a lot on the community processes. We shouldn't shortchange the community processes. That's just, targets are there, but the community processes should happen. The dialogue is what is important.
Fantastic, Tinni, and just really, really resonates this idea of having that faith and having that, that collaborative approach as opposed to this is the target that we want to hit, because ultimately they experience, nurture and maintain those resources in ways that, we can only sort of hope to aspire to do. So thank you so much for that perspective. Alekh, I actually want to come to you with a slightly sort of one of the questions in the chat, which is about traceability in your supply chain and the fact of, you work with so many different sort of retailers as well as farmers, right? And to what extent do you sort of take responsibility for or understand the practices that go on in those supplier and sort of partner systems? And how do you tackle that, if that makes sense as a question?
So I think if I understand correctly, right? So we believe that with climate change, food security is going to be like the most existential crisis situation we will be dealing with, right? Today, temperatures going over 50 becoming like a norm in most parts of the country. Soon, most arable lands will become, very hard to basically grow food on. So, and I think what has really inspired us in the last 2-3 years further is the whole thesis around that building a very, very very, very solid organization that basically, helps consumers, food companies, source food more traceably. And the importance is twofold. One is the consumer behavior in today's world, like you, me, other people, like will demand more conscious food, right? Like they want to know where the food is coming from. They want to know, is the farmer, how are the stakeholders in the value chain getting paid? How fresh is the produce? How is it handled? And what kind of carbon footprint does their supply chain actually have? And this is not only happening in the West. This is actually a trend we see happening across like Southeast Asia, Asia, as well as the Middle East, right? So I think that one consumer trend is going to shift a lot of things in the behavior of how food companies, non-food companies behave in their value chains. So food sustainability on terms of traceability is kind of becoming the most important thing we actually are tracking in terms of our data networks. So we actually for every mile of food which basically goes through our platform, we are able to save at least 30 tons of carbon because of the way we've designed our supply chain, right? And we can give you that data in terms of every shipment we do, right? So what we realized over time is that traceability in terms of supply chain and sustainability in terms of carbon footprint will become like the norm in the next 5 to 10 years. And companies who are solving for this will become very extremely important for humanity. And that's why we stay very motivated in terms of how these linkages from farm to factory to end consumers is going to stay critical. And the more the data you provide to consumers, the more transparent your value chains are, the more conscious the conscious consumers will come and value it, right? So I think that is one clear trend we see happening across the globe, including India actually nowadays.
Super. Alekh, just a sort of really big takeaway is that, just given the existential threat of climate change, this idea of like every food business should be thinking about this. And you give the example of sort of carbon sort of avoided. And so that was very helpful as one specific way of sort of supporting that mission. And, I have a lot more questions on the human side of that supply chain, but I'm going to hold my horses on that just for a second because I want to get us, Divya's views on a couple of very interesting questions. Two very quick questions for you, Divya. One is around, what it is about India as a market that makes us unique. It's a question from Daniel, and like, what are you experiencing both as IIC and when you talk to investors? And I think a second question, if you could take it as well, is thinking about, when, as Tinni mentioned, and there was an earlier question about attribution, right? Thinking about how the work a particular company or organization is doing, it's hard to attribute that to a particular outcome. And so given that that's the case, how motivated are LPs particularly towards that kind of, we need to know that this is our impact? Like, what is the conversation there in terms of being able to be okay with impact being created versus this is our impact that's being created? So if you could touch upon India as a market and that'll be very interesting.
Sure, Pranav. So India as a market, I think one thing that we've gathered from the conversations is the difference in terms of just the demographic variances, the geographical nuances. India is not a homogeneous market, unlike a lot of other countries. So if there's a particular project which is implemented in southern India, you may necessarily not be able to plug and play it in northern India. There's a lot of difference in how the socio-geographical construct is. And this is something which needs to be inbuilt in the programs, which, whether they are programs which are being developed by a philanthropic foundation or even as enterprises which are operating in different states, because we do see a lot of impact enterprises also initially starting off choosing the geographies they're operating in. So this is one thing which kind of makes India a little different. Sorry, what was the second question?
Absolutely, Divya. Around attribution. So how much are LPs interested in creating impact versus knowing that this is the impact that their investments and so on have created? Any thoughts on that at all?
So I'm not really sure if I'll be able to, really give a specific answer to this. But yes, attribution as a challenge is being acknowledged. Because it isn't easy. A lot of deals which take place have multiple investors invested in it. So it's not always possible to really attribute, what kind of impact by what kind of portfolio. Though there are approaches by looking at, the impact created on a pro rata basis of sorts of, how much has been the investment from that particular asset manager. In terms of motivation, there is definitely a very, very strong interest from LPs to be able to understand what has their impact or what is every dollar, the impact per dollar created of their money. And there are a few asset managers who have expressed, who have started working with their LPs to be able to develop these kind of frameworks, which can help understand this attribution as well. Because LPs come with a lot of best practices from different markets, or understanding how their investments in different markets are working. So a lot of asset managers have also now expressed an interest in working along with their LPs to be able to formulate this kind of a structure that can, to a certain extent, help understand the attribution. But to my understanding, it's still something which everybody is grappling to figure. It's not an easy problem to solve.
Got it. No. Very well noted, Divya. So the spread of India from a social cultural perspective, and then this question of the challenges being acknowledged, but people are coming with different ideas for how to approach that. Okay, we're at roughly 5 minutes to go, and I see, again, a lovely set of questions. So this is what I'm going to do is, I'm going to sort of assign one question to each of you panelists, and then alongside that, the one other thing I'd love for you to think about is one hope or dream or aspiration that you have for impact in India in the next sort of years to come. Right? That's really what you're most excited about, you're most hopeful about. I'd love to have that be the final note. But with that, I think maybe let me begin with Tinni. I have one question for you and one hope question. So what's your hope for impact in India? But also, I got a very interesting question, which we also come across often, is how do you distinguish between monitoring versus measurement? It's a fine line. And what's that distinction? And what does that look like for you at the foundation? And with that, if you can give us your hope, I'd love that before I move to Alekh and then Divya.
So, I mean, measurements, monitoring always has that, kind of a negative connotation. I would feel we use the term measurement, and I think that's a nicer term, because when you measure, you learn, you know whether you're on the right track, you know whether, the communities you're serving are also benefiting from the interventions. Monitoring's a bit like tracking, you're just tracking that. But yes, of course, I agree 100%. There is a thin line, but I think in our minds, if we can make it that we're measuring to measure, to improve, to get better, I think that could perhaps be.
Super.
My hope is that perhaps the cycles of impact assessments should be shorter so that they can better inform implementation.
Fantastic.
So that I think it has to be concurrent, it has to be continuous, so that your teams are learning, your communities are learning, that, and you can change, you can make those mid-course corrections. So the hope is that those long drawn-out evaluations just are too complicated. Simplify evaluations, make them quicker. That I think is my hope.
Fantastic, Tinni. Appreciate that. Keep them shorter, keep them more short-term, actionable, and not very complicated. I see we have 3 minutes. Alekh, 2 very quick questions. One is, how do you think about negative impact? And what about the negative impacts that you might be having? How do you try to minimize those? Is my question for you. And then, what are your hopes for the future for social impact in India?
Yeah. So, in terms of negative impacts, generally I feel every action has some kind of a negative impact you do in the community. It's I think being extremely conscious about the way you design things, like Tinni mentioned in the early part of her talk, right? So I think it's just like being extremely conscious about your work and the impact you're creating in terms of your negative impacts or indirect impacts actually is important. In terms of the hope I have for the social impact community is I think we are able to generate more employment for all the youths in their hyper-local communities. I feel India's true development will happen only if you're able to create hyper-local jobs, and the young generation that is coming out of education and who are really passionate about working have employment opportunities in their local communities. And everyone doesn't have to go towards cities. So I think once that happens, India can really be like the destination which we all aspire to be. So that's like my hope for the future.
Fantastic, Alekh. And just so I can sort of get us ending on time, Divya, my last one question for you is, what are some of the what is one best practice that you're seeing when it comes to impact measurement and management in India? And then lead us to sort of end us with what your hope for the future is.
In terms of certain best practices that we have come out, that we have been seeing, Pranav, is a lot of partnerships that are being formed in the industry, and which are also giving rise to different innovative structures. I earlier spoke about monetizing impact outcomes. This requires there being, a civil society organization measuring, mapping the outcomes on ground, somebody tracking those, somebody funding them. So each person, each stakeholder kind of understanding what their role is in the entire game, and kind of collaborating to be able to make this happen, because otherwise it's not a problem that one can solve easily. So that's one best practice that I can see emerging. In terms of my hope, I think what I would really what we are also seeing happening but can happen a lot at scale is a lot of policy and industry involvement in looking at impact as a mainstream space and not something which is bespoke and to be done by a certain group. We are seeing initiatives like the social stock exchange has come up. The government has been speaking about public-private partnerships and blended funds. All of this is talking to impact, and all of this is talking about accountability at both ends of the spectrum. Be it the investor, be it the investees. So my hope is for the for it to be looked as a collaborative effort and as everybody getting involved. And then building a framework which talks to each other, where we have SEBI, we have RBI, we have different ministries, all working towards ultimately trying to, carrying out the same intent. But it's about how do you align these initiatives with what industry is really requiring.
Fantastic, Divya. So if I'm going to summarize that, Tinni, your vision is one for shorter, more actionable evaluations. Alekh, you want us to get hyper-local jobs, not have people always moving to cities. And Divya, I really like that perspective of how can we all make impact more mainstream, not it be something that's happening on the side, but happening mainstream and bringing policy, bringing in industry to collaborate on that. So with that, just a big thank you, Divya, Tinni, Alekh, for you taking the time from your busy schedules to join us today. And of course, to all of you sort of participants and audience members, we've had 80+ folks join today. Thank you so much for all your questions, for your time. I hope this was valuable, insightful, and as I mentioned, hope you take at least one new thing, either an inspiration or an idea or some hope away from today's conversation. So thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully we will find ways to reconnect again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all the participants for all your
Thanks,
wonderful
Pranav. Thanks,
questions.
guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.